Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of our webinar session as part of the Clinical Trials Methodology course. It is my pleasure to introduce Dixie Ecklund, who is the Associate Director of the Clinical Trials Statistical and Data Management Center at the University of Iowa. I'm going to hand things over to her, and I hope you guys enjoy her talk. During the course, clinical responsibility, but she will be talking to you soon. Oh, okay. Big. I'm going to turn off and hopefully.
Hi, this is Dixie. I think when we have two microphones on, you get a lot of echo. So now that Will has signed off, hopefully that's better. Somebody send a chat message if that's not the case, and we can work on that further. Okay, I'm seeing some betters. Good. Well, once again, I'm Dixie Ecklund. I'm the Associate Director of the Clinical Trials Statistical and Data Management Center in the Department of Biostatistics at the University of Iowa. My background is in nursing, but I've also been an IRB chair and an IRB member for over 20 years. So I thank Will and the rest of the team for the invitation to talk to you. He asked me to speak about ethical issues to consider in clinical trials in neuroscience. I also come from the background that University of Iowa serves as the Data Coordinating Center for NeuroNext, which probably most of you are familiar with. And because of that, we have worked on writing grants and applications and have for many different studies. And we also have 4 funded studies. The history of the Clinical Trials Statistical and Data Management Center here is also very heavily involved in the neurosciences. We did the cost study, we did the TOAST study, and served as the Data Coordinating Center here. And I know some of you, I can see who's joined in, are familiar with some of the people who've been involved there. But Bill Clark was the original director here at the data center, and Chris Coffey is now. So that is kind of the background. I tried to think about how to give this presentation, and I felt like I had to. I know people are coming from different areas of expertise and experience, but everyone's involved in neurosciences in some way. So I thought I should probably start with just a little bit of the background on protection of human subjects in clinical trials, which is not a very sexy topic to talk about, but I think it helps to frame the discussion on what you need to consider when you are working with human subjects in neuroscience clinical trials. So of course we start with the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that was revised in 1938. Prior to that time, drugs could be given out. That's the days of the traveling salesman on the wagon selling Coca-Cola that ended up to be heavily concentrated with coca leaves, so cocaine in its components. At that time, the federal government decided that we needed to require that drugs were proven safe before they were marketed, and the act was born at that time. And then that made the assumption that we needed to have clinical trials to move forward to prove that drugs were safe. In 1962, there was the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, which was the first U.S. law that required informed consent. The history on the National Institutes of Health, which actually I didn't know a lot of this until I researched it a bit, but they trace their roots to 1887 with the Marine Hospital Service, which was for merchant seamen along the East Coast. There was a hospital service available, and this became the predecessor to what we know as the U.S. Public Health Service. Within that, there was the hygienic laboratory, and in 1891 they moved that to the D.C. area. And then in 1930, the Ranzel Act changed the name of the hygienic lab to the National Institute, singular. There was only one at that time, National Institute of Health. The institutes began to flourish. By 1937, we had the National Cancer Institute. In 1948, they changed the name to the National Institutes of Health. In 1950, that was the beginnings of the National Institutes of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, or NINDS, which we are heavily involved with in the neuroscience clinical trials, of course. By 1970, there were 15 institutes. In 1998, Congress decided that they had to cap the amount of institutes and centers that were through NIH, and so they capped that at 27. In 2011, there's been a little shifting over the years, but previously National Center for Research Resources, NCRR, was replaced by what's known as NCATS, the National Center for Advancing Translational Science, and this is the center that oversees the CTSA grants and is, in addition to NINDS, is also involved with a lot of the neuroscience clinical trials that we participate in. So we have to talk a little bit about the Nuremberg Code. This is a video that Alex Baldwin starred in, but most of you are probably familiar. After World War II, there was lots of discussions on the international level about developing some criteria and code of ethics for protection of human subjects in clinical research trials. The International Military Tribunal met and reviewed the experiments that had been done by the Nazi physicians on concentration camp inmates. So from that, the Nuremberg trials, they developed the Nuremberg Code, which is that voluntary consent is absolutely essential, that the study should yield fruitful results for the good of society, that the results should justify conducting the study, and that the study should be conducted to avoid unnecessary physical or mental injury, and no a priori reason to ever suspect death or injury. In addition, the risk should not exceed the importance of the question being answered, that the subjects should be protected from even the remotest possibility of injury, that the study should be conducted by qualified persons, the subject should be free to end participation in the study whenever they should so choose, and that a scientist must stop the participation of a study if it's likely that it could result in injury. So these principles have kind of guided everything that has come around since then for regulatory reasons, papers, guidances, all those things are based on the original principles of the Nuremberg Code. So here's the first question. How many institute centers are there within the NIH? 25, 27, 32, or 35? There's a button here that says broadcast results, and maybe that makes it able for you to see that. The answer is B, 27 institutes and centers is what the congressional mandate has capped. Then I thought I'd talk a bit about some cases that have also historically shaped protection of human subjects and through that some of the guidances that we've come up with for ethical issues in neuroscience clinical trials. This is an excellent book. If you haven't had an opportunity to read it, it was a bestseller in 2010, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. Henrietta Lacks was a black woman in Baltimore who developed cervical cancer and went to Johns Hopkins, and her treatment was, of course, they moved the cancer, and from that, without any discussion with her, and not because of any intent other than that's just kind of the way things were done at the times, the first living cell line was developed, and these are known as HeLa cells, and anybody who has worked in laboratories are very familiar with HeLa cells. They're used, bought and sold by billions across the country. I've talked to people who actually thought they were called Helen Lane cells, didn't know that her real name was actually Henrietta Lacks. This book was written by a reporter, I believe for the New York Times, I'm not remembering right now, but she actually met with the family and traced through the history of what had happened with Henrietta Lacks because she was brought in repeatedly to have the cells removed that then were developed into this living cell line. There was never any informed consent. There was no, there was financial gain somewhere, but certainly not for the Lacks family, and that has been documented very well in this book. And it's an interesting read about, again, the way the times were, and it's what's shaped how we think about ethical issues in clinical trials now. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the Willowbrook hepatitis studies. The Willowbrook State School was for mentally disabled children. It was open from the 30s until 1987 when it closed. In the 60s, the investigators there took the otherwise healthy children and inoculated them orally and with injection with hepatitis virus, and then treated them with gamma globulin to see if that would improve the virus. The parents were not told any of this. They were told that their children would be receiving vaccinations. And of course, we have to mention the Declaration of Helsinki. In 1964, the 18th World Medical Assembly met and developed the Declaration of Helsinki, which further added to the principles of the Nuremberg Code and established 12 basic principles to guide physicians in conducting biomedical research. About that time also, in 1966, physician Henry Beecher wrote an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, and he was able to write about 22 examples of published clinical research that placed subjects at risk without obtaining any consent. And remember, it wasn't regulatory until this time that informed consent was sought from people for protection of human subjects. He pointed out that there was competition for funding and that recognition might contribute to the problem of putting subjects at risk, and he recommended evaluation for compliance to the ethical standards prior to publication, which is the norm now for all peer-reviewed scientific journals. 1966, we also saw the establishment of OPRR, Office for Protection of Research Risks. This was through the Department of Human Health and Services, and they developed the policies for protection of human subjects. So at this point, it's still policies, they're not regulations, and this was the start of the guidance for establishment of institutional review boards. And most people are familiar with the Tuskegee study. This study was initiated in 1932, planned to go on for about 6 to 8 months. They enrolled Negro males in the Tuskegee, Alabama area. This movie is called Miss Evers' Boys. Miss Evers was a nurse who lived in the community and actually thought she was helping to work with these individuals. They did long-term follow-up, kept renewing. There must have been a record for no-cost extensions or refundings. And then, and this was all conducted through Public Health Service. But probably the biggest issue was penicillin became available as a treatment in the 1950s, and the subjects were, they were not told this, and it was not made available to them. In the 90s, this came out in an article in the 70s, but in the 90s, President Clinton at the time had a formal recognition and apology to those living and surviving family members to recognize that this wrong had been done. In 1974 is when we were introduced to the National Research Act. This is when the policies for protection of human subject now became the regulations. So this was establishment of the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, which you'll hear people talk about as far as regulations for protection of human subjects. This is also the establishment of the National Commission for Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. That commission met over 4 years and at the Belmont Hotel in Washington, D.C., and they developed the Belmont Report. There's 3 guiding principles to the Belmont Report. The first is respect for persons, and you can see if you think about the things we talked about with the Nuremberg Code, how these things would grow out of previous documents and discussions that had occurred. But it became a guiding principle to respect for persons, to recommend or to recognize personal dignity and autonomy of every subject who participates. There's special protection for those with diminished autonomy. So that's where we start to think about people with neurological disorder, impaired decision-making, cognitive impairment, those kinds of things. And there was description from that the informed consent documents needed to contain information that was understandable to the subjects. That's when they introduced the concept of the reasonable volunteer standard, so that a reasonable volunteer could read and hear the information that's presented and understand what they were being asked to do and participate in. They also included the concept of comprehension and voluntariness. The second guiding principle of the Belmont Report is beneficence. This is an obligation for researchers and investigators to protect the persons from harm, to maximize any anticipated benefit and minimize the possible harm. And this leads to what IRBs consider as the risk-benefit ratio. So the risk needs to be described, what they are to the subject who participates, and then what the probability and magnitude of those risks are. Typically, IRBs will sort those out by severe risks, minor risk, minimal risk, frequency, more than 1%, more than 10%, happens commonly, happens infrequently, so that the subject gets a good understanding of what potential problems they could encounter while they participate in a research project. And then also they need to describe the benefit to the subject and to society. The third principle of the Belmont Report is justice, and this implies that there needs to be fair distribution of the research benefits and burdens. This was where they further developed the concept that you include or exclude persons based on a scientific basis rather than convenience or availability. You saw from the Willowbrook example that those children were included in that research project simply because they were a convenient sample that could be reached and accessed. This was the development of stricter inclusion-exclusion criteria and making the research projects available to all on a scientific basis, and which would protect the autonomy of subjects and also lead to better generalizability of the results. It also talks about two levels of justice: social justice, which means to the community at large, and then individual justice. So just so you can see the numbers and know that they were included as part of this discussion. In 1981 was development of 45 CFR Part 46. In 83 that was revised to incorporate special classes of subjects. But then in 1991 the federal government determined that it was going to be beneficial to codify across the 15 different federal departments and agencies that were involved in human subjects research, and these were all codified commonly, which is what is known as the common rule. Okay, here's a question. Which of the following is not one of the founding principles of the Belmont Report? A is respect for persons, B is scientific integrity, C is beneficence, and D is justice. Just broadcast the result, and you are all nearly 100% seeing that scientific integrity is not one of the founding principles. So a little bit about GCP, good clinical practices. This is a term that you hear thrown about pretty heavily if you're in the clinical research world. It goes to, actually I use that as a question for anybody I interview here, and it's kind of amazing how many people don't really know what GCP is. This was developed by the International Conference on Harmonization. This was an attempt in 1996 to develop international studies because many multi-center clinical trials are, certainly not just conducted in the U.S. There's lots of activity in Europe and also China and Australia and different areas of the world. So they tried to come up with a harmonization so that people are typically following the same sets of standards and practices. And basically this just addresses there are best practices for all these things, ways to get consent, ways to conduct a protocol, ways to organize a site, ways for investigators to be qualified. All those things are laid out in there, and people use that pretty much as their Bible, I would say. I also thought I should talk a little bit about some of the things that happened in what I call kind of the dark ages. I've been involved in clinical trials for almost 30 years now. And so from the start, when there was very little activity and there were lots of like descriptive studies going on. Some of the cancer studies got going. But as you know, as the country grew and as funding grew, there became lots and lots more clinical trials that people were able to develop, get funding for, and people were able to participate in. And then things, it's almost like things got a little bit ahead of themselves. So in the 90s, the country went through quite a bit of time where things were happening that needed to get evaluated, and we needed to find out better ways to protect human subjects. One of those cases was Nicole Wan at the University of Rochester. She was a 19-year-old student who participated as a healthy volunteer in a bronchoscopy research protocol where volunteers would have a bronchoalveolar lavage to harvest cells for lab work, typically. She underwent the procedure, which is a common clinical procedure done hundreds of times a day in many institutions. She must have probably had a pretty strong gag reflex, and subsequently she was administered up to 4 times the amount of recommended lidocaine for that procedure. She developed an acute lidocaine toxicity and died on March 31st, 1996. The investigation revealed that investigators had failed to follow the protocol, and they had failed to properly inform of the risks of lidocaine toxicity that could occur. We also have the Jesse Gelsinger story from the University of Pennsylvania. This was an 18-year-old boy who had OCT deficiency, a metabolic disorder that could be controlled with low-protein diet and drugs. But the investigators at the time had developed a gene therapy protocol where you could infuse corrective genes transported by an adenovirus. Jesse Gelsinger was administered this product, and within 24 hours had multiple organ system failure and died September 17, 1999. In the review of that particular project, it was found that he was actually ineligible on some of the criteria. The investigators had failed to follow the protocol as it was written and had been approved by the FDA, and it resulted in those investigators being sanctioned. And also about that time we had Ellen Roche at Johns Hopkins University. She was a healthy 24-year-old participating in an asthma study where there was an inhalation of hexamethonium. Hexamethonium was an anesthetic agent, I believe, from the 50s that had actually been disproved by the FDA, but it was still available for certain laboratory experiments. She inhaled this product, became ill within 24 hours, and died of respiratory and renal failure 1 month after the study. Her compensation for participating was $365. It was found that the investigators failed to disclose the experimental nature of the research, and they hadn't properly researched the known risks of hexamethonium that had existed in the literature previously. So what happened? The U.S. government halted research. It was pretty dramatic at the time. In May 1990, human subjects research halted at Duke. July 2000, halted at University of Oklahoma. November 2000, University of Colorado. So it was across the country. There were more institutions, but this kind of was all happening on top of each other, and those of us who were involved at the time were looking pretty closely at what our procedures were and how we were administering human subjects protection and participation in clinical trials. This resulted in the establishment of the Office for Human Research Protections, OHRP. There was obviously great public concern and congressional concern about the effectiveness of what was then a 30-year-old system. OHRP began doing investigations of different institutions and their human subject protection programs. In 2000, they issued 78 determination letters, which were, revealing about different centers of findings that they had of lack of compliance or areas of improvement. There was a peak in 2001 of 126 letters and 146 letters in 2002, and then by 2010, I think lots of people had put in lots of adjustments to improve the system. You can look at that a couple of ways. In some ways it slows things down. I know that, people have a lot of complaints about those things, but it also has led to hopefully better human subjects protection and ability to administer clinical research trials across institutions. So here's the question. What does GCP mean? The Great Cleveland Partnership, Good Clinical Practices, the Global Consciousness Project, or the Global Citizenship Project? Oh, everybody gets that one right. Okay, just so you are aware, there are two sets of regulations that provide for the protection of human subjects. There's DHS regulations, which we talked about, 45 CFR Part 46. There are also FDA regulations, 21 CFR Part 50 and 56. They are generally in harmonization with each other. There are some of the regulations that are a bit different, and then it really comes down to understanding whether you are working in an FDA-funded trial or whether it falls under the rules of DHS, whether your institution has signed what we call an FWA, a federal-wide assurance, which then agrees to compliance with all of the DHHS regulations. They're extensive. They're hard to read, but they're available on the web if anybody chooses to. I did want to talk a little bit about some of the definitions that are important. One thing that's pretty basic, but sometimes it's something that gets stumbled over in IRBs, is what the definition of research is. And particularly where this gets muddied up with research versus what's a quality assurance project. So research is a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. It's also important to understand that the regulations apply to human living subjects. So there are research projects, like in particular on organs, deceased people, but that actually doesn't fall under the regulations because it has to be living individuals. And the third definition that is important to understand is minimal risk. This gets talked about in the IRB world all the time. Is it more than minimal risk, or is it minimal risk? Minimal risk is defined as the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. So this concept then does not apply to anything that has an IND, an investigational new drug application with the FDA, or an IDE, which is a device exemption with the FDA. But that does mean, to have your blood drawn, that is encountered in daily life. That a minimal risk study if people are having their blood drawn, as long as it's not, excessive amounts. Just some of the considerations that the IRB must look at for IRB approval. The risks to the subjects need to be minimized. They need to be reasonable in relation to the anticipated benefit and the knowledge to be gained. That the subjects need to be selected equitably. Again, not a convenient sample. Informed consent is sought and documented. There's provisions for monitoring safety. There's provisions for confidentiality and additional safeguards for vulnerable populations. So vulnerable populations are described in the Code of Federal Regulations. Subpart B addresses pregnant women, human fetuses, and neonates. Subpart C is prisoners. Subpart D is children, but I do want you to note that there is no subpart or regulation of the regulation that is specific for people with cognitive impairments. There are mandatory elements of a consent document. An IRB is deficient if they don't, when they review a consent form, if these are not present in the consent form. And they're logical things that you would want to understand yourself if you're going to participate in a clinical research protocol. There needs to be a statement that this is actually research. Subjects need to understand the difference between what's their normal clinical care and what is part of a research project. So what the purposes are, what the duration of their participation would be, and what procedures they're going to have and which are experimental. They need to clearly understand what the risks are, particularly those that are reasonably foreseeable, and those need to be described to them. They need to understand what the benefits are, benefits to themselves and to others, and what would reasonably be expected from participating in this research. They also need to understand if there's any alternative procedures or treatments. So, sometimes they can have the very same treatment off of a study, and they need to understand they don't have to participate in the study sometimes to get the treatment that they're looking to receive. They also need to understand the extent of the confidentiality. If they have questions, who should they call? Questions about the research or questions about their subject rights. They need to understand it's voluntary and that it's okay to refuse, that they can still be seen at that institution or by that physician if they don't participate, and that they can drop out at any time. If the research project is more than minimal risk, as we described, those things encountered in daily life, they need to know if there's compensation available to them and research-related injury, where the treatment would occur and who they would contact if they had an injury. There are some additional elements that are included in consent depending on what the project is trying to describe, and those could be unforeseeable risks, circumstances where the investigator could terminate the subject's participation, if there's any additional cost to the subjects, consequences of the subject's decision to withdraw, and new findings that affect their willingness to participate, and the number of subjects in the study. So the informed consent process, the purpose is, this is seen as the primary ethical principle that governs human subjects research. It empowers subjects to make their own determination about whether to participate and ensures their understanding of the nature of the research and their knowledge and voluntary to make the decision. It's also important to understand that informed consent is not a single event in time. It's a process. It's an educational interaction between the investigator and the participant. It begins with that initial contact, recruitment ads. That's why recruitment ads need to be approved by an IRB so that it can be understand how people are being reached out to. And when studies involve multiple visits over time, the process continues. You need to, as a researcher, you need to confirm willingness to continue by that subject and confirm that they continue to understand what's going on with the process. And consent is a legal concept, and this is where we get into, again, how this applies to neuroscience clinical trials. So only legally competent adults can give consent. Incompetent adults cannot give consent. This includes people who are cognitively impaired, unconscious, or developmentally disabled. But competence needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes there are people who have been declared incompetent and they have a power of attorney who makes all the decisions. But in neuroscience clinical trials, you'll have many, many different instances where their condition might affect their competence, or it can even be, people under a lot of stress. They don't have any condition other than they're under a lot of stress and they're trying to respond to very dense information about a clinical trial, and they're having a hard time understanding. That doesn't necessarily make them incompetent, but it makes them have impaired decision making, and that needs to be considered when you're working in the world of neuroscience clinical trials. There is a concept called assent. This applies to minors or incompetent adults. They should always be asked to assent if it's part of the project and give their knowledgeable agreement that they will participate in the project. A veto by a minor or an incompetent adult should be considered a veto of the consent of the legally authorized representative, unless the IRB were to stipulate otherwise. I have been involved in projects, particularly children bone marrow transplants, where there's been ablation of the marrow, and then a child doesn't want to have another procedure, but because of all the steps that had gone on, they even though they might be protesting that they don't want to participate, the IRB could have an understanding that they will continue in the project because they don't have a good understanding of what's going on, and in some cases the IRB then will say that there is no assent involved in that project because once the decision has been made, it's carried out, unless there's a particular harm that could be encountered. So the consent process needs to be documented. You need to use a consent document that has been approved by the IRB. There's usually a date on there, an expiration date. You need to use the form that is actually within the expiration period. This is a constant problem at lots of institutions because consent and the research projects have to be reviewed at least annually, if not more frequently. And so you need to be using the current consent document. There needs to be a signature by the subject or the legally authorized representative, and a copy of the consent should be given to the person signing the consent. But there are instances where consent can be waived or documentation can be waived, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. So, question: which of the following is not a mandatory element of consent? A statement that the study involves research, B is risks, C is payment, and D is alternative therapies. Payment is not a mandatory element of consent. Sometimes there can be a little confusion because there is a mandatory that they need to know compensation if it's a more than minimal risk. But what I was really looking for here was how much the subject's going to be paid is not a mandatory, especially a healthy volunteer study, is not a mandatory element of consent. So some of the special issues in neuroscience clinical trials that need to be thought about. And really this comes down to decision-making capacity. So impaired decision-making capacity is really limited to just individuals with neurological, psychiatric, or substance abuse problems. You also need to consider that people with those problems should not be presumed to always be decisionally impaired. If we were to limit research to only people who were the least impaired, that it would impact on subject autonomy, which is one of the principles of the Belmont Report, and would hamper research for potential therapies in many, many disorders, in particular in the neuroscience world. And as we said before, unlike children, prisoners, and pregnant women, there aren't any additional protections in the regulations for people who have cognitive impairment. So it's important for the clinical investigators to interact with the subjects and assess their ability to consent and their decision-making abilities. Another important point to consider when working with consent for people with cognitive impairment is there can be conflicting roles and potential conflicts of interest. So the subjects, especially if you're treating the subject for their clinical condition and then also introducing to them a clinical trial and a consent form, subjects, especially with cognitive impairment, might have difficulty understanding the difference between the research and the treatment, which can lead to therapeutic misconceptions. The consent process must clearly differentiate between those treatments that are for their clinical condition and those that are for the research, and as well as the difference between the clinician or the clinical investigator. And I know many of you have to wear both of those hats often, and it's just important that that information is conveyed to the subject so they do understand the difference. That gets to their willingness to participate. It's also an important point to consider is how you will assess the capacity to consent. And researchers, investigators need to be sensitive to differing levels of capacity and use whatever assessment methods you're familiar with, particularly if you're familiar with that particular population that could be tailored to that specific situation. If you simply ask them a couple of factual questions, that might not be an adequate assessment of trying to assure that you know that they understand what they're going to participate in. At our IRB in particular, we don't allow anything in there that says subject says they understand because it's hard to get that as a declarative statement, but you can query in many ways, use different tools to try to understand if the subject does have the capacity to consent and whether they understand what they're being asked to participate in. As we said earlier, the consent process is ongoing, and some IRBs might require an outside witness to observe the consent process, particularly when you're working with cognitively impaired individuals. Unfortunately, there isn't one tool or one place I can point you to that would help you assess the capacity to consent. Most institutions have a couple of documents that they use and they're familiar with. Certainly, mini-mental status exam is a starting point. Some pointed questions about the project. But I think it's important as investigators for you to consider who your population is that you're going to be asking to participate, And then within your IRB application to describe methods and tools that you would use to assess decision making and to assure continuing informed consent. An important point to consider is their comprehension. The clinician investigator is in the ideal position to evaluate the subject's ability, whether they understand the implications of the research and whether they're making a rational decision to participate. And they're also in the best position to make the best judgment of the subject's ability to understand and follow the protocol. And that could even include, caregivers, particularly with cognitive impairment or disease states that affect their ability to function on their own. Caregivers need to be involved here also in understanding whether they comprehend what the research project would entail and what the risks, benefits, all those things would be for them. And investigators are obligated to incorporate any accommodations necessary to assure that subject populations and their caregivers comprehend the nature and the purpose of the study. You also need to consider whether you're getting voluntary agreement. Ensure that their participation is entirely voluntary. They can sign, or their legally authorized representative can sign, but I want you to think about the desperation that comes into some of the neuroscience clinical trials, in particular ALS or folks with glioblastomas. They can be quite desperate. Or parents of children with Duchenne, spinal muscular atrophy, all those kinds of diseases. There can be a lot of desperation there, and that can get in the way of their agreement to participate and then their understanding of what's actually going to happen. So all those things need to be written properly in the consent form, but the clinicians and investigators need to spend time with people so that they truly understand what the purpose is, what the risks are, what they're being asked to do. Lots of IRBs will require a second signature on the consent document so that there is a good understanding by the family who may be involved in what the research would entail. And we've talked about this some already. Most of you are probably familiar with this, but the term surrogate consents is used. Typically in the IRB world, this refers to who the legally authorized representative is. It's important as investigators that you understand what the laws and regulations of your state are, because they differ from state to state. And there needs to be a description in the IRB application of when you will need a surrogate consent and how you will obtain that. In Iowa, we have a hierarchy of who trumps who on legally authorized representatives. The first, of course, is if there is that person, the durable power of attorney for health care, and then a court-appointed guardian, spouse, adult child, parent, and then adult sibling. All those people can serve as a legally authorized representative, and depending on who's available. So really what it comes down to in neuroscience clinical trials and the special ethical considerations you need to do is to understand whether the subject has an inability to comprehend during the informed consent process. And if that's the case, the IRB application needs to reflect that you will be enrolling people who are cognitively impaired and how you will be assessing their comprehension, and that legally authorized representatives will be signing surrogate consents for the subject. And again, if possible, the subject should be given the opportunity to assent. In neurological clinical trials, you also might encounter people who are unable to speak after a stroke. They might have full understanding or comprehension, but inability to speak. And again, you still need to be able to assess that the subject understands the trial. You can query with some yes and no questions, but you wouldn't just want to simply explain the trial, put a piece of paper in front of them, and then say, do you understand? You might also encounter people who are unable to read or write, I guess I should say. And again, you just need to be able to assess their comprehension. As far as reading, whether it can be read to them and they understand that, or signing is a different issue. Most states will recognize that if they can mark an X, that's proof of identity and intent. I did want to talk a little bit about emergency research consent waiver because this can impact on neuroscience clinical trials also. The FDA and DHHS regulations allow for some types of emergency research to be conducted without the prior consent of a subject or a legally authorized representative. The exception here is only limited to those research activities that involve human subjects who are in need of emergency medical intervention, but they are unable to give consent because they have a life-threatening condition. So this has certainly been used in acute stroke trials or traumatic brain injury trials. And for this to move forward, then the IRB needs to make several determinations to approve the research. It has to be life-threatening. It has to be shown that obtaining consent is not feasible. It has to be shown that participation holds a direct benefit to the subjects, that the research could not be carried out without a waiver of consent, and that the proposal describes attempts to contact the legally authorized representative within a window if it's feasible, and that the IRB must review and approve the consent that would be available to legally authorized representatives or subjects if they gain capacity later, and it would be appropriate to ask their consent to continue. I know one proposal that we looked here at University of Iowa IRB was the Rampart study, which probably lots of you are familiar with. And in particular, there was a project where paramedics out on Interstate 80, which runs right through the middle of the state of Iowa, would be able to enroll people in this project without consent and administer a blood product or normal saline for resuscitation. And there was a lot of effort at that time to do the steps that are outlined here on additional provisions that need to be made for emergency research consent waiver, including consulting with representatives of the community. Investigators went all over the state and met with different folks. There was a public disclosure. There were open forum meetings held at high schools and senior centers and wellness centers. And in this particular case, folks were given the ability to opt out through publication. They were told if they never wanted to be enrolled in that study, they could write, and they got a bracelet that they would wear all the time, and the paramedics were instructed to know to recognize that, and then they would not enroll them in that particular project. The additional protections are that the public needs to know the results after the study has been completed. There needs to be an independent DSMB, Data Safety and Monitoring Board, and as previously stated, plans on how they would contact the LAR if feasible later, or inform the subject later on. So just some final thoughts to think about is because neuroscience clinical trials can be kind of a desperate situation for folks, it's important to understand that and consider that, and that could lead to undue coercion, that subjects may have comprehension difficulties, and that in addition, because neurological trials are their own kind of animal, there are certain nuances that are very difficult to explain even to people who don't have neurological disorders or cognitive impairment, and those are things such as the concept of biomarkers. How does that affect a subject who's trying to understand why you would want him to participate in this research project? And then even some of the more elaborate things like adaptive randomization and dose assignments, trying to explain to them what dose of drug they could possibly get when it's an adaptive design is a difficult task to do. It needs to be thought out properly. Final considerations: informed consent's the cornerstone of protection of human subjects. Investigators need to take into consideration the abilities of their potential subjects in order to properly execute a subject, in order to properly execute informed consent. And I'll put in a little plug here: we need more clinical trials in the vast array of neurological disorders. And final questions. I do have one comment here from someone who says, I wouldn't trust an aphasic patient has full comprehension. And I think that's exactly the consideration you need to know. And that's where the clinician investigators certainly have a better understanding of the status of their subjects. There may be people who are aphasic but have full comprehension, and there may be people who aren't. And that's why you need to be able to work with them, discuss this with them, make sure your IRB application reflects all the efforts you're going to make sure that they do comprehend and understand. Any other questions or comments? Thank you all for joining in. I appreciate it this time. I'm not sure if everyone is able to read all the chat comments or not. Subjects with oral apraxia only, then may comprehend, but they are not aphasic. I understand that. Lots of nice things. Okay, Will is asking if folks are able to do an evaluation. It looks like something's popping up. We're getting a lot of feedback, so if you want to mute me, Will, that's fine. Will says, click on the link for your evaluation.